Hi, everyone. It's Keith again. Good evening. As you can see, I'm still in my classroom. It's been kind of a long, hectic day. If you've lived in Kansas today and right now, obviously, know we went through a decent winter storm. So if you walked outside, you probably noticed it's pretty white out there. Hopefully, you're staying warm and your pipes haven't frozen up yet. Make sure you run that water. It's one of the biggest things that we need to do during this time when it's really cold. So. Anyways, tonight I'm going to talk about our second introduction video or chat video with the transcript that'll be below later. So we're going to talk about medieval medicine continuing. Obviously, I don't know a ton of information historically on medieval medicine. I'm what you call, learn on the go or learn on the fly, whichever way you guys want to put it. But these readings that Dr. J has given us and the quizzes in particular, I go through the quizzes and I'm really finding some of the stuff that I'm learning fascinating. And these books are really helping me intertwine my historical knowledge on medicine and how it's developed over the age. So I'm going to go ahead and get into this. My observation of Mont's book and really how medieval medicine is historically starting to take shape, you do get kind of that clear vision of what scholars kind of view at it, and readers maybe as well, on the actions of the early physicians within the medieval period. As a person in a family would say start to feel ill, and these are probably, I would say, more wealthier or higher social standing families. Remember, a lot of the poor people, or from what I understand, that lived in poverty or were considered, minor, probably didn't have near the medical uh, look after or feedback as or need as, say, the higher society would. So these patients of these higher social standing, these medical professionals would really take turn and try to figure out what was going on with them. I guess one of my biggest things would be what was anything hereditary or or being passed down from one generation to the next. So then you look at to clarify some of these observations of medieval medicine, of these individuals getting sick, the question you ask yourselves, how did it all happen? How did they end up getting sick? Were they walking down the street and did they see were there some feces on the ground or rats running around or whatever? And maybe they were just, caught up in it with somebody sick, coughing a little bit, and then transition it that way. Also, the concept of transatlantic crossings and having poor nutrition, and also with animals getting into the food, could also take a huge toll on some of that stuff. These are the arguments that not only I think about, but I think the quality of medical profession during the time period is what some of the scholars would argue. But then I go to look at it at a different perspective. I look at it as kind of a historical means as well. Not only in the medieval period do you have illness that you could question, well, is it hereditary or did they catch it from somewhere or not? But then you look at, well, look at the timeline as it goes on a little bit. You do see Indians, or excuse me, Native Americans catching smallpox as expansionism happens. You see the yellow fever that develops over in Europe and takes a toll on some of the plagues throughout the years that take shape. The early 20th century, you have right after World War One, the influenza of 1919 pandemic, Spanish flu, as you might call it. You had that major war that broke out, and you're looking at things like, well, does what ended up catching that, and was it because people were so close together that they were just passing from one person to the next? I think we kind of see that even today in the COVID-19 pandemic. You have to wear a mask, and if you're around people, that's kind of a huge deal. So one thing that really, or a couple things, I guess, that really sticks with me, and when you're a person like me who's kind of with history, I'm not focused on one point or knowledge on just one area. And you're looking at and you ask the questions like, well, what is the advantage of me or someone else looking at a historical textbook compared to like a academic one necessarily. Well, an academic one's going to be the focus point on like why did people die within medieval medicine, or from the Spanish influenza of 1919. You're going to have all that information and what had happened. And some people maybe be like, oh, that's okay, but uh, the juice isn't going to be there saying, learning about one of the major battles of World War I, or the sinking of the Lusitania, for example, the ship being hit by a German U-boat. The action, as some would call it, would be would be the biggest would be the biggest thing, with some of those advantages and disadvantages. So I think when you're looking at things, people want that action, but they also need an understanding as well. So I think a couple of those advantages and disadvantages really hit home with some people rather than others. And I think the biggest thing we have to realize is everybody's different. I mean, we take this class, for example. My thought process is going to be different than some of my peer classmates. So those are a few things that I want to look at. I think when you look at bias, everybody's biased at some point or the other. When you look at scholars in particular, and how medieval medicine was looked at, and did they do the right things? I guess the bias of this, professionally, did they do the right thing? Some of us could look at that and say, well, I don't know if they did necessarily, but you do see some of that I don't know if I would call it roles in society, but maybe you could. So like women's roles in society as medical professionals, you would have the men that would say, well, I don't know if they deserve to be medical professionals or not, but they do have a lasting impact on it. So overall, when you're looking at how things are done, even from the medieval period, the tiniest of things such as urine, and studying it, to studying a person's body as they weaken and maybe over the course of possibly dying, plays a huge role. And women in particular, as we see, and as time goes on, will play a huge role in the medical profession. So that's something that I think that looking at bias, you do see a little bit of scholars being biased towards the roles of women, scholars being biased towards the roles of certain medical professionals and what they should have done and what they shouldn't have done. So I do think you see that overall concept of how medicine does play a role. So I really did enjoy this book. I think there's a lot more that we could talk about in the future, but anyways, I'm looking forward to your responses, and have a good evening, everybody. Stay warm.